This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mr. Edward H. Wadsworth, interviewed by Pendleton Woods on April 9, 1971 in Clinton, Oklahoma. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 30, 1990 by Joel Todd.
This is April 1971. This is Penn Woods in Clinton, Oklahoma, visiting with Mr. Edward H. Wadsworth, and he is called Dick Wadsworth. He is an old-timer in the Clinton area who came here the year after the area was opened. Mr. Wadsworth, I think just to open up, I will ask you to tell me who your parents were, where they came from, and how they happened to come to Oklahoma.
Well, Robert W. Wadsworth and Joanna Wadsworth, and they were from Davis County, Indiana, and they come to Arkansas City and spent the winter there, prior to moving out to the claim northeast of Arapahoe. And the reason they moved there was to get land. They only had a little 7-acre tract in Davis County, Indiana, where I was born, and they couldn't think anything about staying on that when they could get a land gift to them in the Oklahoma Territory.
Tell us the manner in which the land was allotted in this. How was this area open?
It is open for settlement in 92. They is allotted. The Indians were allotted all the best land, or I considered it the best land, and the land that wasn't allotted now was laid open for settlement, and they made a run for it. And my father had been waiting in Arkansas City for the opening of the Cherokee Strip. And he got tired of waiting there, and then he down to El Reno and walked from El Reno out to Arapahoe. And then he stopped at a man's house. He'd been there a little ahead of time and put up a little house, Joe Shives. And he told him he wanted to stay all night. And he says, well, Shives says, come in, Mr. Wadsworth. There's always some tramp or other stopping here. And he wanted him to stop because he had relatives in Arkansas City, and he thought he might hear from them. And then he said, well, says, you come in and stay all night, and you might decide to stay and file on a claim in this county. And so the next morning, Father told him, says, I want to go back on the stage now. When that stage comes through, I've got enough of this. And so his Shives took him out to look at some sod corn he had planted, and he held him out there, and he always says, there's that doggone stage, says, you can't get to it now. Says, I'll go back and get the mules ready, and we'll go over to the county seat, Arapahoe. And he says, you might decide to stay here. And he filed him on this place when he went over to Arapahoe, you know.
What was the specific location of this place?
It was a mile north and a mile and a half east of Arapahoe. And he thought he was getting 80 acres on the south side of the road he didn't get. On the north side, there's some good land on it, but it wasn't. The northwest 40 of it was a terrible, terrible canyony rough 40. And he didn't think he'd getting that till after he had it, you know. And so then you see how long that's been. 78 years. The 7th of this April that just passed.
Now, you came in the following year, is that correct? Or did you come in that same year?
Well, he filed in 92, and we come in 93. Then they were on covered wagon from Arkansas City, Kansas. And we We didn't have any bridges to cross on rivers or anything. As kids, we walked across the South Canadian River. And they camped on the west side of the river, because the history of the river was, it might come up overnight and you'd have to stay a long time. They camped on the west side, and no water could be found. And my mother went down the river and hunting for water, and a man had camped near us, and so he was digging for water, and she found the pool of water, and she yelled for him to come. They had plenty of water, and down there and got water, and then he moved up and camped at our camp. And that is the first time I ever saw a bear track. And as a little kid, I stayed close to the campfire that night. There was black bears around. That was northeast of where Thomas is now, the old Crow Crossing, where we crossed the river. And there was black bears in there. I've been told since then that they used to actually. We didn't see the bears. We just saw the tracks. But that's enough to keep us in camp. Now I want to tell you. And then we drove on down, and so my father got sick, and my mother was driving, and she drove a day the wrong direction. And happened to meet up with a cowboy, and he told her the trail. We had no roads; it was just trails across the prairie. And he told her how far to go back to the trail, and we had to drive a day back there, and get back on the outfit. Then we got to the place, and then the government had appointed the county officers, and Bill Hughes. You remember Bill Hughes, the Arapaho. Well, he was appointed county clerk, and he had a farm on Deer Creek. And then the Indian agent was the fellow that helped start this town here. That,
What was his name?
let's see.
Avant?
Jim Avant. Well, now Jim Avant and Hughes drove up to where we were setting up our tent. Says, now, Mr. Wadsworth, said, you can't never make a living here, because it never rains enough to wet a man in his shirt sleeve. And so we went ahead and set up our tent, and then later we moved our tent farther south and put it up and began to dig a dugout. Well, then's when the flood come. And now it was a few years later. I was just a little old kid then, we went to school at Arapaho, and we had a preacher for teacher, W.S. Deering. And he asked all of them that knew anything about the big, great flood, hold up their hands. And mine, I got way up high, I knew about that flood that we had. And a little boy answered. And I was so glad he answered, about the 40-day and night flood they had in the book of the Bible. I got my hand down under me, and I stayed close, Of course, I was going to tell him about the flood we had in the tent. That's the only one I knew anything about. And that was a flood. Now, I want to tell you, there's no land plowed here in the county at the time, in our part of it anyway, and all the water run off. We went down that canyon where we had our tent set up there about 100 feet wide, and there was a fall in the canyon about 10 foot, and it rolled over that, and it roared and roared all night. And so that was our first flood that we knew anything about. Well, then my father had a little old pony team, and he couldn't make them work. He had what they called a Nebraska sod plow. And he couldn't make them plow the sod, and he went to Arapaho and got a man to come out and help him. Finally got him so they'd plow, and plowed some sod. And he didn't have any way of planting the Kaffir corn, and he used an axe. He'd make a hole in the sod and put the seed in there and set his foot on and move up, Finally got enough out for the team cow that winter. And then times were really hard, you know. Talk about pioneer now. We had it. We had hard times. And the different school districts, and Father was a school teacher. And so he taught the first school district in the Lone Star School District to the east of us. That was where we went at that time. Then he went north to what they call the Birch School, southeast of where Custer is now, and he taught that. He got $25 a month for teaching the school, furnished the wood, and hauled the water, and done the janitor work himself for $25 a month. 3-month terms. Got 6 months school teaching about. And they after we had our first dugout up a little while, why the Indians went to Darlington. All the able-bodied Indians went to Darlington for rations. That's called Concho now. And the cowboys went to the camp and started the ruckus, the drunken cowboys, and there's just the squaws and the old Indians there, and the old Indian shot a cowboy and would have got another one, but he lost his bridle rein and his horse run off with him. Well, that is out, go straight west from Arapahoe till you hit the breaks out there, about 10 miles west, somewhere in there. And so the cowboys gathered in there. They was going to hang the Indians that had shot this white man. And there was 2 men at Arapahoe that rode to Fort Reno to get the cavalry to come out. Ross Hardenbrook and John Lobeck. They rode just all night. They'd changed horses and went through. And they started the cavalry this way, and they got over to Deer Creek. Why, they took the old Fort Elliott Trail to Deer Creek. They camped. Somebody told them there's no use in being in a hurry, everything is all right. And they hadn't anyone got camped till another man rode up. It was Judge McKnight. He was a Haunted County judge, I think. He rode up and said, "You better get out there quick. If you don't, why, every white man, woman, and child is going to be killed in the county if those Indians are hanged." And he says they've got the scaffolds built to hang them. Well, they remounted and come on what's called double quick, you know, and they passed our dugout, and they looked so pretty, you know, on those horses, you know, with their uniforms on. They had the old Army uniform, and of course I rode a stick as a cavalryman for a long time after that. But when they got out to this camp where the Indians were located, now this captain of the cavalry told my father this afterwards. They camped on Beaver Creek east of Arapahoe, and he said he rode up to the head of his command and ordered them to make ready. And then he said to the cowboys, you know, he said, "Disperse, you sons of bitches." Well, now, anybody that knows a cowboy knows when you call him a son of a bitch, you get home the best way you can. Well, they said that those Indians, those cowboys, he said they just went across the prairie like coyotes when he told them that. And then the Indian that I carried mail to out here was there. He'd come to Arapahoe, and they'd ordered all Indians out of Arapahoe. And he stopped and went in to see what was the matter. And they told him. Well, he untied his team and run them out there, you know, to where they was going to hang those Indians, see if he could be any service, you know. He was leaning up against a tree there when the cavalryman rode up, and he dispersed the cowboys. And this Indian had been with the cavalryman on lots of raids that they'd made with the outlaws. That book tells about those raids, the outlaws, this one here. And so he says, John, are you drunk? John Otterby was his American name, and Lean Elk was his Indian name. Well, he said, no. Well, he says, go down in there and dug out there and tell those Indians to come out that we were protecting them. And he went down in and he told me that, he said, had the cowboys went ahead, the sheriff had went out, and Jim Monroe had went out and took charge, but they gave him 15 minutes to turn him over, or they'd take him over his dead body. And they looked up on the hill, and here come the cavalry. And so this Lean Elk now, or Otterby, said there had been some killing going on. He didn't know how the Indians had got him, but they had several rifles in that dugout, well loaded. And when they went in there to get him to hang him, there'd been a lot of killing going on. And so they brought the Indians back to Arapahoe, and the cavalry camped east of Arapahoe. And my father talked to he'd walked to Arapahoe quite a bit. They camped east of Arapahoe on Beaver Creek, and they stayed there a few days. And father going to Arapahoe, he stopped and asked the captain, says, don't you hate to face the bullets when you have to go in battle? Oh, he says, you can't do that, be afraid or anything. He says, you can't always be a sunshine soldier. And now they kept those Indians there, and of course the cavalry went on back to Fort Reno, but they kept, I think, 2 Indians there at Arapahoe under guard for some time, and then they were released and went back to their camp west of Arapahoe. But what I started to tell you about the Indians going on the warpath. After that, they had red moons on the warpath. Well, we got our dugout, first dugout, and was living in it. And the road from El Reno to the west part of Oklahoma here, Cheyenne, went right past our dugout. That was the main traveled road. And this Star mail carrier to El Reno had a son living on the place on east of us, on north of Turtle Creek. And he wanted to get out there and notify him to get to Arapahoe because Red Moon was on the warpath. And he yelled as he's come around the west side of the canyon. Our dugout is on the east. So my father, to get your family and get to Arapahoe. Red Moon's on the warpath. Well, that excited my father, and he didn't know what he's talking about. Well, he ran around. He had to come around the canyon anyway, and he ran up where he was going to meet him, ask him what he'd said. He says, I told you once, and that's enough. Red Moon's on the warpath. Get your family and get to Arapahoe. Well, we got to Arapahoe, but the Indians now wasn't so sure about having Red Moon go on the warpath. And there was a house that had been built by the government, Little Wolf, for where Little Wolf Spring was. We had to haul water from that over southeast of Arapahoe there. And the Indians met there. Now, I got this from a man that worked on this allotment. And the Indians met, and they had a powwow all night long. And just before daylight, this Little Wolf Indian, he was a chief, he says, now all Indians that want to stay with the white man, says, we've put off this war too long. He says the soldiers had come out here and said we'd lose the fight. And he says all that want to stay with the white man says come over on my side of the house. And just as the sun come up, he had all of them. And so Red Moon didn't go on the warpath. And that Red Moon on the warpath was the outcome of these Indians going to be hung out there, you know. But that was settled.
What year was that, did you say?
That was in 94.
You had mentioned that your father's claim now in 92.
Yeah,
And
92.
your family came down in 93. Did he have to stay down here from 92 until your family came in 93?
No, he had 6 months to move on the land.
I see. So he went back up.
He went back to Arkansas City, and then we rigged up a wagon, covered wagon, and we moved down in the covered wagon.
You described the part of the covered wagon trip, and can you think of any other experiences that you have not mentioned on that covered wagon trip?
Well, the covered wagon, now there's very few fellows left in the country here now that could rig up a covered wagon. But that was quite an incident for me, to watch that. You see, the front part of the gear, the wagon tongue, why, there's some bars comes down through there, and the axe is put through there and drops down, and there's where they carry the axe. Well, then the hatchets on the sides, of the bolsters, those little hooks, rings that come around there, why, they put that down in there, And then the frying pan goes there, and on the back, why, we had cooked chickens. Father brought the first light bream of chickens into the county that was ever brought in here. And he got them at Arkansas City. He got the culls of a fellow's flock. He wouldn't let him have anything else. And so we brought them, and they had them on the back of the wagon. And so they had arranged, they had a straw tick in there for a bed to sleep on. And they'd brought everything they could put in that covered wagon now, and the family still ride in it. And so we'd go into camp, and I learned how to build a campfire. We'd gather wood as went along like the Indians do, so we'd have it when we got into camp. And when we finally we'd set up the tent, at night. And I learned how to set up a tent. And then we'd have to break camp, load everything back in the covered wagon. And, of course, when he'd unhitch the team, bring the harness back over the wheel on each side. They call that Texas style. And so then we finally, after we'd landed and got everything going in the dugout, then the cattlemen called these fellows that was moving in nesters, and they didn't like them. You see, the reason they didn't like them was on account of the cattle. You see, the line east of Arapahoe, north and south there, east of that was herd law. and west of that was free grass. And so they didn't like that for the nesters to move in. And they had to build on west of there what they called a government fence against the cattle. Well, the cattle would go on through, and the nesters couldn't raise anything. And when my uncles moved down from our Kansas City, they stayed for the race in the Cherokee Strip and got nothing. Why, they come to our place and plowed sod for us and put it to careful corn in order that they could haul it over onto their place, and stack it up in the winter for their stock. Of course, they couldn't raise it on their land because they got it for the free grass. And so they, one thing I remember about the free grass now, my father made a speech against free grass. And the cowboys, every other building, in Arapahoe then was a saloon. And the cowboys got drunk, and there was a traveling man in there, in the Charlie Noyes store. My father's in there. And one of these traveling men went in and told him, said, now, says Mr. Wadsworth, says, the best thing you can do is to get out here and get your team and get out of town. Because that cowboy dragging that rope up and down the street intends to rope you and drag you to death right down the street here. So as he was making speeches against free grass.
Why don't you tell a little about the free grass argument,
Well,
whole issue?
The free grass, you see, the cattle could, they could just go on anybody's land that they could get on, And the grass was free. And when the nesters moved in and settled there, why, there was trouble to them. And the cattlemen, they wanted to go ahead with this free grass. Now, one of the free grassers that had the cattle was our later man, Cy Houndstein, Arapahoe, and the banker, and postmaster and all. He was one of the cattlemen. And so there was a big fight about it. And north of Arapahoe, northwest, why, a number of farmers collected one night and drove a big herd of cattle down to what's Weatherford now. Slipped around and left them there. And the cattlemen had left their cattle, and they was over in herd law, and they had to pay for them to get them. And they'd have some awful times about this free grass. And when they finally voted it out, why, it was a hard fight. But they voted it out, and they done away with free grass. But now I might say something or other about, it's kind of going out of the way a little, but before this country here was brought into settlement, why, they sent out from Guthrie was the capital then, and they sent out a number of men, to appraise this land for release it to cattlemen. Well, they brought a small boy along with them, and it was in the spring, late in the spring, and our daisies were in bloom, and they'd had good rains, and those daisies, now, I've seen them that big around, and buffalo wallows sticking up, different colors. They're beautiful. Well, they met to assess this land, and this little boy would happen to be around. They assessed it at 10 cents an acre with the cattlemen for pasture. And that little boy says, what? Says 10 cents an acre? He says, for land that's covered with water lilies worth 50 cents apiece? He thought those daisies were water lilies, He'd come from the north where they had water lilies. And he thought there's water lilies. And they just 10 cents an acre is all they had. Well, the farm that we had over there, had been in that cattle business there, and there was an old saddle one of the cowboy saddles that had laid there, and all the leather and everything was off of just the hull frame of the saddle was there. If we had sense enough to have done it, of course there was no leather fellows then to have made it, but a good saddle could have been put on that frame. And my mother found an old Army six-shooter that had been used in the Civil War. It was a good one. And she was afraid that brother and sister would get some powder and load that thing up and get killed with it, and she give it to Frank Dyer at Arapahoe to get rid of it. So now there's another instance, it's getting away from it. Our first couple that got married in the county was this Frank Dyer and Lula Coakley. And they were the first couple married in the county. And the county then was known as Arapahoe, 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 and the county was known as G County, OT, Oklahoma Territory. Now I remember well when they held the election, to name it Custer, but I don't remember any other name being brought into the election, to name it Custer, but I don't remember any other name being brought into the election but Custer. There probably were other names that was voted on, but I remember one fellow says, I don't care. He says, if they call it Bunker Hill, he says, I don't care, but they named it Custer County. And I remember that so well,
Do you remember what year that election was? Do you remember what year they named it Custer?
No, I don't remember exactly. But
you've talked a number of times about a dugout. Why don't you describe a dugout? What do you exactly
well, I can sure describe a dugout. Now, the first dugout we had was dug in the bank of a canyon. And my father dug this dugout on another man's land that hadn't been filed on yet, but it was filed on later. The surveyor, the county surveyor, had been appointed for surveyor. Why, he was along there, and my father asked him about the line. And he stepped the line. He said he didn't have any way of measuring it right then, but he'd step it. And there was a cornerstone to the east of the place, and he went over to that corner and stepped back, and he stepped to the center of this canyon. But the line was about 8 feet east of where my father built the dugout, but he'd built it on the other man's land. Well, he dug this out in the bank, and as I remember, why, it was about 14 by 28, and we went to the canyons, and he cut down trees, and I'd get on a pony, and he'd put a chain to these logs, I'd pull a log in, then I'd go back and pull another one in, and he used these logs now to lay along the side, and then across the ends, built the ends up, and the ridge pole of the dugout roof. Then he went to a sawmill and got the boards, that had been sawed off, when they were getting ready to make the lumber. Slabs, they called them. He got those slabs. They didn't charge him anything for them. He got a load of slabs and brought and put them on, and then we put the dirt, shovel dirt on that, and they had one window in the back and a door in the front end. And now that is our first dugout. But they got, when they found out it was on the other man's land, why then he built another one farther back east. and we moved into it. Then that wasn't enough, and they built another one back of that. So we had, altogether, we had 3 dugouts. But the one we had to tear down on the other man's land. But we lived in it about 3 years. Then the other 2 built together there. We lived in them. But there was one thing about it, the roofs, we never got good enough, but when it come a heavy rain, they'd leak. They were really that bad. But now while I'm talking about dugouts, why, in the early day of the county, why, we had a papered Arapaho. It wasn't called Arapaho Bee then, it's called the Arrow. And Frank Fillmore was the editor of it. And he had filed on a claim south of us about 4 miles. And he had built a dugout, and, along the canyon banks, lots of places, there is a formation that they can make a kind of cement out of, Looks good. Well, he had plastered his dugout and thought he had something extra. He had 2 girls and his wife. Well, when a big rain come, why, a rat hole or something got into this dugout, and it filled in water up, about 3 or 4 feet deep. And he'd had these girls laying on the floor of the dugout, and he had to get up and he put them on the table. Well, way in the night, one of them got to dreaming and rolled off into the water. And he had to get out of bed, get that girl out, and put her back on the table. And now, some of the dugouts absolutely look nice, but ours never did look so nice. We never had our walls put with any degree of plaster on the walls. It was just the plain old walls. The dirt, had been dug. And now the place where we had our dugouts, I was over there, a couple of years ago, and everything's all filled up. Nobody could ever tell that ever was any dugouts there.
What is there now?
It's just the wheat field comes down to where we had our dugout, and seems like the place to the west where we was on the other man's land must be connected with this other land. The fellow by the name of Shepherd owns the land now, and Bert Darnell did own it, and then he died, and Mrs. Darnell sold it to Shepherd. And I think the part where the dugout is on the other man's land is part of the Shepherd land now, and it all works together there. But it'd be harder now to re-allot this land and file on it again. And the farmers, settlers go in there, the nesters, and get any dugouts or anything done. They couldn't go to the canyons and get the trees. They've all been cut out. And so we just went anywhere we wanted to over there, and cut these trees down and got what we wanted, the cream of it, to make the roofs, the dugout. But now there's no timber in there anymore that would make it. And there's no houses. You can go a mile north of Arapaho and go east, and the first down the creek there, where you'll see a house north. Then you go east, and you'll go 4 miles before you find anything that looks like where anybody could live.
Backtracking again to your trip down, what kind of a path or roadway did you take to get this way? And did your covered wagons travel in groups? Did you have several?
No. It was every fellow for himself. The Indians then were friends to the settlers. We never had any trouble with any of them. But we'd camp. We'd make our own camp. And the one place there where I told you that fella come and camped with us, was looking for water. Now, he went northwest up to about where Woodward is now. Somewhere in there is where he had filed. And he went there. He had a beautiful dapple iron gray team. It was just something beautiful, while we just had ponies. But every fellow was out for himself.
Have you known trails to follow to get here?
Well, yes, they'd have a trail just over the prairie, but you could miss your trail. My mother did. My father was sick and sleeping back of the covered wagon, and by gosh, she missed it, and we went a day too far in the wrong direction, had to come back. But those trails now were, you see, they were no graded roads, no bridges, and I was a mail carrier at Arapahoe before they had a road grader in the county. And I remember that the road grader out on the route, and they just graded one side of the road. They didn't have money enough to grade the road. Just graded one side of the road. And so it was worse than if they hadn't graded any, because when the big rains come, why, it'd cut across there and make ditches, But for years afterwards, before they got these roads graded and section lines out, I remember the first section line laid out west of Arapahoe. That fellow Shives I was telling you about, he got the job of laying out the first section line. He took his mules and the sod plow, and he found where the lines was, and he run a furrow over here, and then he run a furrow over on the other side, and inside there, that was the road, section line. But we just traveled. Now, the road that we come in on from Deer Creek was a trail come down south of where Custer is now, southeast there, and just come across the prairie. What later, when the fences began to build, was the roads then. I expect there's farms over there now that still shows the old road where it come through, like the Fort Elliott Trail. Now, I have a place north
about the Fort Elliott Trail.
I have a place north of Arapahoe, the Fort Elliott Trail crossed, and it still shows on the place. But now we had this early day, brother and sister and I, we had good times, even if it was hard times. We enjoyed it.
What was some of the entertainment that you do, she said?
Well, after the schools started, they'd have literaries, and they'd meet, and they'd have spelling matches, ciphering matches, and so they'd get everybody to spell down. I remember one night this fellow Shives, he thought could spell every word in the old blueback speller, and Father and him were the last two up. Well, they pronounced to him the word nair, and he left out the apostrophe. And Father caught it and put an E', nair. And it turned Shives down, Father wondered. Well, he says that apostrophe wasn't in the blueback speller, because I could spell every word in the blueback speller. And I know one night with a fellow that, John Dixon, he is kind of interested in a girl, and he wanted me to give my place to him. I was about 5 ahead of him, and he'd come around and wanted me to move back and let him there, you know. He said I'd miss the word anyway. It'd come around and I spelled it. And I went up 4 or 5 higher, you know. And that got me clear away from Dixon. Get close to his girl, you know. But we had some times there. The young fellows that thought they were real wild and woolly cowboys would get ponies to break the Indians, and they'd ride them in there, you know, and tie them up. And then after our literary is over, why, they'd get on these ponies and they'd start off pitching and take their 6-shooters and they'd let the fire fly, you know. And so they one night, why, the father went and we'd got our first buggy. And we couldn't tie it to any hitching post or anything. Father tied to a heavy rock. And one of those fellows come out to get on their ponies, and they turned our team loose. And they went down this Turtle Creek and left the buggy down there and got loose and went over to this Shives place and got in a lot over there, you know. And we had a time of getting our buggy repaired, and just on account of the wild and woolly days, you know.
Can you think of other things about the school?
Well, the school now, they had finally some northern people come into the neighborhood, you know, and one was a northern school teacher woman, Hattie Arnold. And these Southerners didn't like her because she didn't talk their language. And they met at the school meeting, and they wasn't going to allow her warrants. But my father and a fellow named Carlberg was on the school board, and they saw a way to get our Hattie Arnold, you know, that didn't talk their language, get her warrants. They filed her warrant in ahead of the teacher that had taught before, you know, that talked their language. And then they said, now, if you want to keep anybody from getting their pay, why, you want to look out for your school teacher, because our warrant has been filed, the clerk. So that settled that. But now this Hattie Arnold, why, they didn't like her, and there was a time there at the school that my brother and sister and a fellow by the name of Benham, Barney Benham, was all that went to school. The rest of them wouldn't go on account of this northern teacher. She didn't talk their language, and they wouldn't go to school. They wouldn't let their children go to school. But she went ahead and taught the school out and got her pay for every month of the school, but she wouldn't teach anymore. She was through with them. And they used to, you know, when I'd get a whipping at school, why, they'd tell on me, and then my father would give me nothing. Well, this Hattie Arnold was a little late to get to school one morning, and we got up on top. There's a half dugout and half sod, you know. And we crawled up on top looking for her. We all crawled up there. One of the neighbor women, where she'd stopped to get water to bring to the school, you know, told about us being on top of the schoolhouse. Well, she come, why, she put us in on a bench and give us all a whipping for getting up on the schoolhouse. And so that was one time they didn't tell on me, because they got it too.
Why don't you talk a little about the trail that you were, the background of this early trail?
This trail that wrote about.
The name of the trail and a little bit about it.
Well, that's this letter right here.
All right.
See, that's, whoop, here. See, that's it right there.
Just the letter.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the letter.
Yeah.
And now this here, this fellow that wrote this was a geologist that was going through the country, and he was coming back to write another one, but he never come back. This is a guide to Roman State Park. That's an interesting book. Robert O. Clay wrote it, and he tells about the outlaws that we had in the early day, you know, and the women that went with the outlaws, and one of them that camped with them and cooked for them, you'll find in there, was named Little Britches.
Did you have any first-hand knowledge of any of the information in that book, or did you supply any of that information for his?
No, I didn't supply any for that book, but I was supplying for another book, but he never come back to write the other book.
Tell us about Fort Elliott. And about
Now, the Fort Elliott Trail starts at El Reno, and it goes to the northeast, and it crosses Deer Creek south and east where Custer is now. And this Indian scare I told you about, there was cavalrymen, they followed that Fort Elliott Trail till they got to this side of Deer Creek, to the road that led to Arapahoe, the trail that led to Arapahoe, and then they took that. But now this Fort Elliott Trail was, it gives the time, I think, in that there when it was first started. It was long about, I think it was sometime in '78 when it was first established. And the government had trains, wagon trains, you know, freight that they hauled to a number of different places. Those forts, Fort Elliott's one, and then when you see this, that tells about when they killed Black Kettle over here, you know, and all of those things happened along this Fort Elliott Trail. But it's now the places, the towns that the Fort Elliott Trail in the west has been established, marked by the states, but the trail itself had never been marked. It'd be, nobody could follow that trail as it used to be. But the road had been followed for a long time, ways there. See, we went in the early day here, we were doing what we called steel cedar out of the Caddo. And we traveled that Fort Elliott Trail for quite a distance, going east, before we left it to go on over into the Caddo. And but to actually follow the Fort Elliott Trail, well, that's a has-been. All the land's plowed up and the fence and everything. It'd be hard to find. But it's very plain on the place I've got up there on the hillside where the Fort Elliott Trail come through. And I could have learned a lot about the Fort Elliott Trail because one of the cavalrymen that guarded the wagons was a brother to one of my neighbors, and I talked to him a lot. And he told this Indian we had here, Mad Wolf, in the early day, he says, Mad Wolf, he says, the only reason you're alive because I missed you. He says, I tried to hit you as hard as I ever shot at a dog, but I missed you, and that's the reason you're here. Well, you see, Indians would try to get those wagons, rob them, get them, everything they had. But that's the reason the guards went along with them. And that trail now hits north. Well, it goes on west from where the place I've got up there. And this place is 5 miles north of Arapahoe. And crosses Beavers and goes west and south of Butler. Then it goes to the northwest from there to, I don't know whether that calls it or not, but it was originally called Lobete, Texas, where it went to. But there's different it gives in that letter. See, I wrote to Oklahoman to find out about the Fort Elliott Trail. See, that's something that's not known. These publishers, the Oklahoman didn't know anything about it. And the party that had written an article for the paper at El Reno for years and years never knew anything about the Fort Elliott Trail. And so they Oklahoma referred to this woman, my letter, asking about the Fort Elliott Trail, and that's the letter she wrote me about it. This here explains what she wrote. And so it's absolutely a has-been, but it was used for a number of years. And then, you see, I got out to Lobete, Texas. Well, then they went off to Dodge City, Kansas. The trail come down from Dodge City, Kansas, across there. And there was a number of other trails this tells about that come down through there. But those tells about the Elliott getting killed out here, west, and Black Kettle getting killed, and so you see, they would have never had that big Indian fight. That when Custer was killed, he had let the Indians alone. They was going back when they had this Battle of the Washita. They was going back to the reservation, and had he given them a chance, went in and asked them to surrender or anything, well, there wouldn't have been a battle. But that was the coldest that I ever have any history of in this county. It is 22 below zero the morning of that battle, and Custer gave his men all a big drink of whiskey apiece and sent them in to shoot every Indian they could see. And the squaws even climbed trees where they'd shoot them out. They didn't care anything about them. The Indians, they was killing Indians. And Black Kettle was killed, and then they all surrendered and went back to the reservation. But they would have went back peacefully if he had given them a chance, but he didn't do it.
Tell us a little about the growth of Clinton.
The growth of Clinton? Well, now there's a difference of opinions about this, how Clinton got started, Our place there northeast of Arapahoe was surveyed out. The railroad was supposed to go through it, come from the east. They went across there twice with their surveying crews, and we had a bull that would fight anybody. And there's surveying through there and running that pole up and down, and he took after him. And the fellow throwed his hatchet at him, and he crawled through the fence, and then he had to wait till the bull left before he'd get back and get his hatchet. Well, we thought we was going to have a railroad, but they finally put the railroad down for what's now Indianapolis, brought the surveying outfit there and built it there. But they had a report out that Arapahoe, the railroad company, offered to build it through Arapahoe if Arapahoe would furnish so much money. Well, my father said that he was in touch with everything that was done, and he said they never offered to build it through Arapahoe for so much money. They surveyed out their route, and they thought they could build a cheaper where they built it down on the river. And then now this Jim Avant helped start Clinton. And I used to ride across here years ago on a pony before there's ever any town of Clinton dreamed of. And we crossed the river up here where that bridge is now. That was just called a ford, you know. All these places we crossed the rivers with no bridges or fords. We crossed there on a ford. And I'm south, and they had for a long time there in the bottom of what they called a corduroy road. They cut trees down, laid them one right beside the other in the mud hole, and they drove across on those timbers, you know, that corduroy road. And when Clinton first started now, why, they had what they called when the railroad stopped, you know, the Clinton siding, they called it. And so they had the town lot sale and sold lots. And there's different ones at Arapahoe would haul passengers down to Clinton from Arapahoe. And the town, see, we had out here Parkersburg. I guess that had disappeared before you come here, hadn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that Parkersburg now moved to Clinton. They had a number of pretty nice buildings there. And so they moved to Clinton, helped build Clinton, and then the town in its growth for different things, you know, they seemed to fight every other community in order to improve Clinton. Now, they tried to do away with Butler. They tried to do away with Parkersburg. And they tried to do away with every place. They did do away with Parkersburg, you know. I worked on the railroad as a boy down here 8 miles from Cordell. And I got my time check, and I went to Parkersburg to get it cashed there on the river. And so then when I carried the mail out of Clinton here, why, there was a they tried to do away with Parkersburg, and they tried to do away with every place. They did do away with Parkersburg, you know. I worked on the railroad as a boy down here 8 miles from Cordell. And I got my time check, and I went to Parkersburg to get it cashed there on the river. And so then when I carried the mail out of Clinton here, why, there was a section foreman lived at Parkersburg that had a mailbox on the route, a Mexican. And then finally all of that disappeared, and everything moved to Clinton. But the Clinton, after so long a time, now had a real growth. But we had a fellow at Arapahoe named Charlie Vaughn, run a store at Arapahoe, and the farmers out northeast of Arapahoe, south and east of what's Thomas now, all the way they had to live was to go over in the Caddo and steal cedar and bring to Arapahoe and sell to the post, and Charlie Vaughn bought all the posts. He didn't need them, but he bought them, and Pa stacked them up back of his store. He had great ricks of them stacked up there. And of course, after the nesters come in, why, got this free grass done away with, why they built pasture fences and fenced their farms. And he sold all his posts. But that was so great now that when Clinton tried to get the county seat, now they was doing pretty well. And they kept after it. But this Charlie Vaughan deal now, I don't know whether you ever realized that was it or not. But that's what kept Clinton from getting the county seat, was Charlie Vaughan. He bought these posts, and all those old nesters over there that hauled them to Arapahoe, and all their friends and relatives that growed up over there afterwards, they remembered Charlie Vaughan. And some of them got around over the country. They'd moved to Butler and different places, and Weatherford and other places. But every one of them voted for Arapahoe for the county seat. And they couldn't get the desired majority in order to move it. Then they were still trying to get the county seat, and all the lawyers agreed to let the county seat stay at Arapahoe but one. And he said, no, we want it to an up-to-date, proved town, and it's not good enough. Well, the government had given a location for the courthouse at Arapahoe, and they'd built this courthouse, and money had been appropriated out of our taxes for a number of years to improve this courthouse. Well, if they moved the courthouse after all these years, all that money had to go back to the state. It was for no other purpose could it be used but to improve or rebuild the courthouse. Well, Clinton decided they'd better let it go, because all these farmers and voters over the county decided they lose all those thousands of dollars that had been appropriated would hurt Clinton, and so they dropped it that time. Now that's a fact.
Who were other early leaders of Clinton that you can think of? Early.
Well, you see, I lived at Arapahoe, northeast of Arapahoe.
When did you come to Clinton?
I come to Clinton, I moved off the farm. I got a mail route here, and Sam Hawks was postmaster. And I got a mail route, and so before I could get moved down here, why, they discontinued the route I was supposed to have. But Hawks gave me a temporary job on a route here. And I moved down and took that temporary job, and I carried with the team for 9 months. And that time that I carried with the team, why, there was a route over at Indianapolis. A man by the name of Langdon. Now, he had married this Hattie Arnold I tell you about, that school teacher. He was the mail carrier, and he had to retire. And he retired, and a fellow named Newman carried the temporary while I was carrying temporary here. Then they moved me over to the Indianapolis route. Now, you see, I was carrying at Arapahoe under the Burleson administration. Burleson was Postmaster General. But I had been appointed under a Republican administration at Arapahoe. Of course, Wilson and Burleson were Democrats. And one morning I went down after I'd carried about 4 years and a half, regular, and there was a letter in the post office that said, discharged without cause. This Burleson had discharged me, to make room for Democrats. And then later on, when I got this appointment here, why, the Republicans were in, and they appointed me carrier over to Indianapolis. And I went over there carrying mail, And the postmaster over there, he had made a deal with one of his patrons, lived east of the office, to transfer a man from Tennessee. Well, he didn't like me a little bit. And he was going to, at the end of that first 6 months probationary period, he intended to fire me and try and make his transfer. But this fellow, that a Republican here at Clinton, that had okayed my appointment over there, for the route, I caught on to it, and I went to him and told him about it. And now he was a little bit mad. He says, they told me to make that appointment, and I made it. Says, you go back over there and carry that mail. He says, he was a little bit wicked about it,
Tell about the physical carrying of mail. What was involved in these very earliest days? How did you travel, and
well,
the problem?
We always had to take a physical examination before we get to take the examination, and we had to pass that. But we had horses and buggies, and then later on we got mail hacks. And over at Indianapolis, I had a mail hack. I'd carried the mail hack here. My father was carrying the mail hack at Arapahoe when I was carrying on this temporary route here with the mail hack. And they always called little boys, would call my father Waddy. And so he'd come down out east here at this Union School, west this Union Schoolhouse. He'd come down north of that. And the family that had been on his route had been changed over to the route I was on. And a little boy come out with his daddy, and he looked my mail hack over. And mine had a door in the back that I got in, and the other one, my father had doors on the side. And he looked at it and went around it and looked, and his daddy was standing there. He says, this is a different outfit. Says, old Waddy says, he gets in from the side, and this one gets in from the back. And now we had our horses that we had to carry in the mail were really lively boogers. If that wasn't, deadheads was no good on the mail route. And my father had a runaway over at this Union Schoolhouse, and the team come over to this Avant, Hill Avant lived there then, and they was in his lot. And they come down from Arapahoe and got the team and back. And then I was a substitute. I had to carry it till he got his mail hack fixed up. They tore it all to pieces. And the little kids come running out, when the team tore up the mail hack, and my dad was spilled out. And they cried and said, he'll never carry mail for us anymore.
How about the roads?
The roads, now, here was the road. There was, they'd make a trail down through here. And then it gets so deep, the ditches would have high centers of the wagons and the buggies. Well, then they'd move over and straddle that one of those ditches, and they'd run another one. And they'd move over the same way and run them, as many as they could. They're in that road. Well, I'll tell you about a case now. I was carrying on the route out of Arapahoe, and I'd been up on Sunday night a little bit, and it was right west of Arapahoe, for the east of that, on that hillside there where they got all those old cars, The road went north up that canyon there to west of Arapahoe and then come into Arapahoe. Well, I going north there, served my last box, and I went to sleep. First thing I knew, a little girl yelled and yelled and yelled, and says, could you get out and give us the road? Says, my mother can't get out of the trails here with her team. Could you give us the road? I got out of there as quick as I could, never let her know that I'd been asleep. But that is the way of it. You had to look ahead to see somebody coming and make arrangements to get out and give them the road. And there I was, But that was, our roads were just trails. And so it was a long time before we had anything known as a good road or a graded road.
Talk
Now-
about talk about Clinton in about 1900, right? About the turn of the century. What was it like then?
1900.
Yeah, sometime in that period. In other words, in the very early days.
Started in 1903.
Did it start in 1903?
1903.
Well,
The 1900 is just a siding here
Oh, I see.
to the north. And
what caused it to come? What caused it to begin to build up? Was any sort of a factory or industry started here, or was it
No,
a farming
no.
center?
You see, this was Indian land.
Mhm.
And they bought this land of the Indians, and they had to get a permit from the government, the Indians, to sell this land. They were what they call, they were government. They wasn't free Indians. The government had to okay it, and they okayed it. And they tell the story that Arapaho tried to get the government not to okay the sale, so Clinton wouldn't start, after the railroad come down here. But after they got where they could sell the lots and had their town lot sale, why, there was a number of lots sold, the first sale, and the town started. And I remembered they had a few saloons here in Clinton, too. And I was down here at the first celebration now that they had after the town had started. And one of the buildings that had been moved over from Parkersburg was down here right east of where the Hawks Hotel was there. And on the east side of that building, while drunks were laying there in the shade, just stretched out sober enough. they'd got real soaked,
What all happened on this celebration?
Well, they had a balloon ascension. That is down where that filling station is down there now, right beside the river bridge. And when the balloon went up, why, it turned to the northwest over, it come down over about where Barnett comes into the Washita, somewhere over there. But now they neglected to fire the shot, for the man to cut loose, and for his parachute come down. And he couldn't hear it when they shot. And he just kept going. And oh my, how that woman, I guess she must have been his wife, how she screamed, He'd get killed. But he rode the balloon down. He stayed with it. He didn't parachute. He went so long and got so low, he rode the balloon and come on down to the balloon. And he made it all right. I remember seeing him, and they started right out across the prairie, and they crossed the river somewhere out in here to the northwest to get over to him, to get him back.
What else did they have at the celebration?
Well, they had horse races, and I think they had a carnival, didn't they? Yes, I'm sure they did.
What year was that?
That is the first year is in 1903, wasn't it, when it started? Well, that is in about 1905, I think, or 6, when they had that celebration here.
What are the very early stores or places of business you remember at Clinton?
Well, now the Frisco Avenue here, why, it was like Arapaho. There was about, you might say, every other building was a saloon in the early day of it. And they traveled then. They traveled in buggies, wagons. We didn't have anything, cars. And they had hitch racks. in front of their stores and at the hotels that they'd tie the horses, and saddle horses and all of them too. And it was well supported, the town was, after it first started.
Any of the early stores that still are in existence today?
Well, there's one store here that his father-in-law used to be at Arapahoe.
Call it Jeffries now. You think about Mr. Simpson?
Yeah. Jeff Simpson
Yeah.
run at Arapahoe.
Tell about that store.
Well, Simpson moved down here from Arapahoe and started the store. And there were other stores moved out of Arapahoe down here to Clinton. They had what they call, you see, the Jews, where they had a store, if the town's going down, why, they see a town that thinks
Go ahead. Why don't you think, you may have some questions that might help us lead into it from, that would be good things you might talk about.
You probably covered this. Your father didn't take part in the run, but it was the same year?
the same year the run. No, he wasn't in the run. He was holding off, for the opening of the Cherokee Strip. And it just got where he didn't know when it was going to open, and so he come to El Reno and then walked out here and then filed, and he went back and got the covered wagon going and moved down. And then after that, my grandfather, John Lucas, and his wife, they come and filed north of Arapahoe. It's right where 33 makes that turn to go to Custer City. The place on the west there was the John Lucas farm. Now the Lucases, there was a bunch of them in there. The one north now was Del Lucas, and the one to the east was Warren Lucas, and the east place that I have up there was Marion Lucas. They were all in there together,
Do you remember, you hear a lot about the story of Red Buck. Do you know anything about that?
I sure do. I do.
I think that's pretty interesting. You kind of
Well, now, Red Buck and John Miller. George Miller, wasn't it? Yes, George Miller.
Hooky, they call him.
Hooky Miller, but he got hooked when Red Buck was killed. That's how he got that hook, Well, Red Buck was known in the South, Texas, where he come from here, as Bill Waitman. And he used to work for Ruth Cobb's father in Texas before he come up here. And the story goes that Red Buck had been offered, and Miller, $500 to kill Bill Cavness. And a fellow named Glover lived just on a farm west of Barnett Creek on the north side of the road there, the first good farm there. Why, he has hired him, they claim, to kill Cavness. And he had went to town to get whiskey and paint for him to paint up so nobody know him. And they was living in a dugout on Glover's land. And Glover got drunk and told it, Arapahoe. And he come back, why, Red Buck saw that he was drunk, and he turned him in. And so he up and shot Glover. I went to school with Glover's daughter at Arapahoe, and he just shot his brains out. And went right over the corn crib, just splattered all over the corn crib there where he was standing. Well, they got up and left, Miller and Red Buck, They went up Cobb, run a store known as Old Jip Store, the northwest there, and they got their supper at Cobb's store, and then they went back southwest to a fellow's dugout known as Pickle Simon's dugout. He's living there in a dugout. And of course, now that's something that I never did like, never could understand. Anytime Red Buck and Miller rode up in your yard and hobbled their ponies and said they was going to stay, well, they stayed. It wasn't any of your business. They stayed. Well, that's Pickle Simon now, after they had their raid there on this dugout and killed Red Buck and shot Miller all to pieces, why Miller gave up. But then they put Pickle Simon in jail for 6 months at Arapahoe for harboring criminals. And I never liked that because I know different ones that kept Red Buck and Miller, and when they rode up in the yard and said they was going to stay, they stayed. There's no going around it, you know. Well, this fellow, when he was buried at Arapahoe, why, Mrs. Gossett lives southeast of Arapahoe. Her husband used to haul water from Littleville Spring to Arapahoe in barrels and sell it. Well, they were friends of Red Buck Miller, and he was buried on Mrs. Gossett's lot in Arapahoe. And for years after that, why, she had put flowers on his grave and a little note on the flowers, gone but not forgotten. But one of my friends at Indianapolis, after I was carrying the mail there, said that Red Buck never stayed all night in that grave. He had a half-brother run a saloon named Morgan in Arapahoe, and he had a farm northeast of Arapahoe, and he hired help. And they went down and dug Red Buck up and took him out there and dug a grave and put him on his farm. And that's the fellow that told me that is Rosation, and he knew Red Buck in Texas. And so some people say that he was never took out of there, you know, he was never buried there. But when the railroad, Frisco Railroad went through, they went through this fellow's place, and they dug that grave up. And there's an old fellow that lived a mile north and a half a mile east of Arapahoe named, he isn't Evans. He was up there and he got a sack from the camp and went up there and got those bones, and I saw him. He brought them down to his place. And they were red, and they said Red Buck was Indian, you know. Enough Indian that his bones would be red. Well, this man Sessions said he was buried on that knoll. He never stayed overnight in that grave at Arapahoe. Well, nobody believes that story I tell them about him being dug up there, but I'll wager if they dig that grave out, they wouldn't find any sign of anybody ever being buried there. Because nobody ever called Rosation a liar and got away with it. He was an old cowboy, and they'd have Wild West rides out there, and all the horses throw everybody around. He'd say, let the old man try it. And he'd buckle on his spurs, and he rode everything.
Who was it killed Red Buck? Pickle Simon Ranch.
At Pickle Simon,
Yeah.
it was the sheriff of Roger Mills County named Joe Fenchner that killed him. And Joe Fenchner got shot. A bullet hit the belt, his cartridge belt, and exploded one of the bullets and went down through his groin. And I went to school at Arapahoe, and I went to Doc Williams' office where this Fenchner was. That was the reddest-faced man I ever saw in my life. And he said that he just had two good men with him on that raid. And so one of them was named Wagner. And, of course, he was the other one, Fenchner, you know. There's just the two of them that were good shots. For some reason or other, now, Fenchner didn't want to kill Miller. But he wanted to kill Red Buck. He thought his only chance was to kill him right now. Well, when he come up out of the dugout, you know, why, just as he come up out of the dugout, well, Frenchman shot him. But when Miller come up and started to shoot, well, he just took off a finger. Miller had on the trigger. He picked up another one and took off that finger. Picked up another one and took off that finger. Then he shot him in the arm, and they had to take the arm off. This right arm, I think, he took off. He just had this finger and a thumb left on his arm. And they had a hook on this other one. That's why they called him Hooky Miller. And he was a real shot, but he said he wasn't anything compared to the Redbuck. And up at Custer City, his brother, John Miller, run a cotton gin at Custer. And old boy that run the engine there, why, he made fun of Miller shooting. I says, you couldn't hit anything. Well, he says, step off 20 steps out there and take this can and put it on a post. I'll show you what I can do. And so he did. And he just whirled his six-shooter around that little finger and thumb, come around where he fired, off went the can. And he went and put it up again, whirled it around, and off went the can. And he says, that's good enough. Says, I don't want you shooting at me. And Miller told my father, now, Miller was a friend of my father, because my father hauled cotton to the John Miller cotton gin when it was Old Independence. And that's another thing, just, you know, off of the subject a little bit. But my father helped build the first bridge in the county, and that was to haul cotton to Miller's gin at Independence. Well, when this Miller told my father, he said, you know, the meanest man I ever killed, said they had a bronc riding contest, and he says, and the bronc was the highest in the air. Well, he says, I looked over, and he said, there's a fellow behind a tree, stuck his head around with a gun to shoot me. He says, I got him. He says, that is the meanest man I ever shot. And when the horse was the highest in the air, I got him. Well, they didn't think any more about telling about killing a man than we would about killing a stuck-egg dog. Not a bit. And now, Millers, for some reason or other, they had a friendship with my father. So, in the early day here, my father was carrying mail to Arapahoe with a team. Why, he had his horses staked out on the hillside there at Arapahoe, and a couple of fellows, they had a big Indian powwow at Custer City, and a couple of fellows went out and stole his ponies and took them up to Custer City to this Indian business. They intended to get a lot of Indian mules and take them down to this big pasture, you know, where you've heard of that big pasture, where they take stolen stuff and sell it. And so they went in the saloon. They tied them up behind the saloon, and one of them got a little bit drunk and told what they had out there. And Miller knew whose horses it was. Miller went out and turned them loose. And they come home. I was living west of Arapahoe on my grandfather's place at that time. And so they had a trial of these fellows, you know, for stealing the horses. And they had Miller as a witness. And he said, how would you go out of the saloon and turn horses loose with being stolen? He said, I wouldn't allow anybody to steal my friend's horses. And it's all because, you know, the father hauled so much cotton to the Miller gin, others, you know. And the first bridge now that is built in the county, the Custer City, on that first section line, and go south till you come to that creek, first one, and there they cut trees down, pulled them in there, and run the big one across here. I was a kid and I was there. And then they run these logs across there, nailed them down, and then they could haul the cotton across there to the gin at Independence. And that was the first bridge I remember of in the county. And when our dugout, you know, I'd stand out on the dugout and watch people come past there on our road. And I could tell them the man's name, every one of them come along there for a long time after that. Every one of them. They'd filed on claims, and that's the only way they had to get in Arapahoes, come past our dugout. That was the main road. And I knew every one of them. But there was roads were just next to impassable and improbable, you know, in every way. But now this George Miller and Red Buck, why, they just went to people's houses and stayed there. And I guess Red Buck would have killed a number of different men if it hadn't been for Miller. He wouldn't let him.
Any other things that you can think of in the historical area that you might have some?
Well, I don't think
But now there was a outfit cave north of Tologa on the river there called the Red Buck Cave. And Miller and Red Buck stayed there a lot. And Red Buck was a fiddler, one of the old-time dance fiddlers. And he fiddled for lots of dances up there near that cave. And they said he was just as congenial a man as ever was. He was good.
Where did you get that name?
What?
Where did you get the name Red Buck?
Well, I guess it was an Indian name, Red Buck.
He was part Indian.
He is part Indian.
What's that?
And but I've been told by different ones that come from Texas that said he went by the name of Bill Waitman in Texas. When he come up here, they give him the name of Red Buck. And now I'll tell you another story about Red Buck and Miller. Father and mother and brother and sister come into Arapahoe. Charlie Norris run the store there. And so as we drove up to Charlie Norris' store, we traded there all the time. And Mrs. Norris and Norris was being marched down south by Red Buck and Miller, afoot. They'd robbed the store, and they had their horses tied in the canyon down south of Arapahoe, and they marched them down there, you know, to where they had the horses tied, and told them not to look back for, I think, 10 minutes, going to live, and then they come back up to Arapahoe. And we were there just after the store had been robbed. And so when the Red Buck was killed out there at that dugout, he'd got Mrs. Noyes' watch, and she objected to him stealing her watch, and Red Buck slapped her for objecting to the stealing of the watch. But they got the watch back after that. And before they were killed there at that place, Miller's all shot up and Red Buck was killed, they had their horses shod at a blacksmith not far from there. And the blacksmith wouldn't charge him anything, but his wife was standing there, and they just unloaded all the change they got out of the Noyes store right in her lap, you know. She held her apron up and they rolled it in there. Pay for the horseshoeing.
What is the first factory or plant that you recall being built here?
Being built here? Well, the first one that mounted anything was the cottonseed oil mill. I tried to get a job on it, but they had all the laboring men they wanted. If I was a bricklayer or professional anyway, they'd hire me, but they wouldn't hire me. They had all the laborers they needed, so I had to walk back home out east of Arapahoe. I'd walk down the railroad track here. I was sure going to get a job, but I didn't get it. Now that was the first. That was the first real outfit that went in here, was that oil mill.
We've been visiting with Mr. Edward H. Wadsworth in Clinton, Oklahoma, in the offices of the Clinton Daily News. For possible further research, I make note of the fact that the Oklahoma Geological Survey, Guidebook number 9, titled Guide to Roman Nose State Park by Robert O. Fay, published in 1959, has considerable information. This book should be in the Oklahoma Historical Library or the Oklahoma State Library.